Latinx. A person of Latin American origin or descent, used as a gender-neutral or non-binary alternative to Latino or Latina.
Latinx. We're black, we're brown, we're white. We're immigrants, we break binaries and cross borders. We speak all languages and are of all abilities, faiths, spiritualities, sizes, gender identities, sexual orientations, and documentation statuses, and we're here to stay.
I'm Alejandra.
I'm Ana.
This is Latinx Mental Health Podcast, where we talk to therapists, researchers, artists, activists, and students about their experiences in the intersections of mental health and Latinx identity. In each interview, we aim to connect through our voices, our struggles, and our triumphs, as we sample a different herbal tea, just like Abuela used to make.
For this episode, we spoke to Neathery Thurmond, who is a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in Austin, Texas. She specializes in eating disorders, body image, LGBTQ+, trauma, substance use, and works with teens, families, and adults. We drank Be Happy Tea, a blend of hibiscus, lemon balm, oat straw, and hawthorn berry, and talked about health at every size, eating disorder treatment with marginalized communities, and increasing access to training and treatment spaces.
This episode contains discussion of eating disorders and gender and size discrimination, so keep that in mind while listening and take good care.
The Latinx Mental Health Podcast is not a substitute for professional mental health care. We encourage you to seek resources and support in your community.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hi.
We wanted to start out by asking if you can tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a therapist.
Absolutely. Well, I'm a social worker, clinical social worker. I went to UT Austin, so hook 'em horns. Nothing from Alejandra. Okay. Not a sports fan. Got it. But I did go to UT Austin, and I haven't ever left since then. Before that, I was in undergraduate school at Trinity in San Antonio. Got my psychology bachelor's there. And then I spent a year in Philly, just 1 year, and then I came right back to Texas doing research, and that's when I realized I really wanted to be a social worker. I was doing research with low-income families, and it just did not feel great to just collect data and then not ever see them again. So I wanted to really be in direct service. And then I came to Austin, and here I am.
And when you were in your program, was there a way that you knew what type of social work you wanted to do, or when you graduated, what was the path that you took?
Yeah, so I was a clinical concentration major for my graduate, and I've always known I wanted to work with eating disorders since I had a research job in undergrad. So that was kind of my path from the beginning, so I knew that. And then my final internship for graduate school was at an eating disorder treatment center. I worked there for several years, and then moved to a substance use treatment program, worked there, and then to private practice.
Yeah, so one of the reasons we invited you on was because you have a professional Instagram, like social media presence, not just Instagram, right?
Mostly Instagram.
Okay.
I'm having a lot of fun with that.
Okay, yeah. We're going to put a link to that on our page. You talk a lot about working with, like, there's this idea of what a person with an eating disorder looks like. And you talk a lot about how it, more often than not, does not fit that mold. And working with individuals who do not fit that, like, idea. Can you talk about how eating disorders are sort of viewed, like,
Sure.
yeah, viewed just in general?
Yeah, I think the stereotype out there and what unfortunately the media does portray and has a huge role in perpetuating the stereotype is that it is a white, cisgender, which means the sex they were assigned at birth is the gender identity they ascribe to, and thin white woman of a certain SES status, so usually a higher income level. And that is unfortunately the stereotype that keeps getting portrayed out there.
Mm-hmm. And how does that impact treatment?
Oh boy, it impacts treatment so much. I'm very passionate about this. It impacts treatment from the beginning in terms of research. Research historically has only been with white women, so we're not really having a lot of good data out there that show us just how much the prevalence is in other cultures and other communities, or what treatment actually works across the board. So it's kind of a one size is supposed to fit all treatment that is research-based, and it's not quite true. So more and more research is coming out, but it's very, very limited.
So from your perspective as a clinician, how do you approach working with individuals who do not fit that stereotype?
I'm very much social justice oriented, staunchly anti-oppression, and we just get angry about oppressive systems, and I do a lot of educating of oh, actually that is an injustice. Oh, that is oppression. I had a client who is a person in a larger body, and she has a hard time getting comfortable on an airplane. And so her thought was, well, I just need to lose weight. I was like, hold on a second. Why don't airline companies just make better seats that are inclusive of all people? So it's really debunking a lot of cultural, norms that have been passed on throughout the years and really saying, hey, why don't we do something about it instead of make people hate themselves?
And have you had much experience working with the Latinx community?
I have, yeah. So I would say I'm not extremely fluent in Spanish, but I can get by. And so I'm one of the few eating disorder specialists who can actually utilize Spanish language in practice. So I have seen and worked with quite a number of Latinx families and kiddos primarily. And it's really unfortunate that the stereotypes are out there as the way they are, because it's just not talked about. So people just don't know that what they have is actually a really severe eating disorder. And that's the saddest thing, I think, and the biggest thing I'd like to see changed is the idea out there that eating disorders affect everyone, no matter where you come from, no matter who you are, you can be impacted by an eating disorder.
Yeah.
I know you also work a lot with the queer community, and I want to take a minute to also talk about that. And I mean, I'm assuming that there's some, there's intersections there and similarities in that you're working with a marginalized group, but I think it's important for providers to know, well, what are some of the specifics? What are some of the things that you're coming up against when you're working with people who are LGBTQ identifying?
Right. Again, and so this kind of goes across all marginalized communities, is just the lack of understanding, lack of education. So prevention, can be started just by talking about eating disorders, that it affects everybody. The other thing is the treatment is a little different because of minority stress. And so working with marginalized communities, I do target minority stress and just have real conversations about it, and really getting into one, radical acceptance that the culture is how it is, and also what can we do to actually take power back. And so really coming from a more empowerment stance and also getting angry. There's a reason why people are angry. That's a normal reaction to oppression.
Can you just briefly explain what minority stress is?
Yeah, so minority stress is really, depending on whatever community or culture you come from that is a minority group, is the experience of stigma, of bias, of actual complete life or death threat, safety issues. So depending on, that might look like for a trans woman, it might be just someone outing them as being trans, and that's not being a safe thing to do in most areas. So at the fear of, being who you are is not okay in this culture sometimes, often, especially with, if we're going to get political, which I always do get political, with the climate that, is out there in our presidential cabinet these days, it's only getting worse.
Yeah. I just have an aside. Have you all seen Latino History for Dummies yet by John Leguizamo?
I started it.
Okay, it's on Netflix, and he kind of talks about this minority stress, but he calls it ghetto rage. And I just love that expression, this anger about knowing that you're being screwed over, basically, and not being able to really do anything about it. Right. And also the self-hatred that comes in with that. I think that's a big part of it, is that we're taught to be ashamed of ourselves. And so on the one hand, you know that you're being screwed over, but you're also fighting this other battle of not being able to accept who you are. And so you get like stuck in this really angry place.
Right. Well, and your value, because the same narratives are telling you that the narratives you're hearing are correct and true, and that you don't have the same value. And so it can feel that your anger is misguided or overreacting, or because you're not valuing necessarily always yourself in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I often in my work have seen folks internalize the anger into an eating disorder. Aside from many other reasons, but a common theme is kind of not knowing what to do with that anger because it can feel overwhelming, right? These are huge oppressive systems that have been around forever. So it is kind of daunting, and folks like to have some sense of control, and sometimes that means taking it out on yourself.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what a lot of people don't understand, right? That it's not just about changing the shape or the size of your
Right.
body, that it really is an expression, that it's using your body to communicate something to others or to yourself.
Yeah, often, and I say this with my clients too, in fact, I said it today many times, that focusing on your weight is just really the tip of the iceberg. What's actually underneath that, and it can be a whole host of different things.
So as we're thinking about all of these different societal forces at work, what do you think are some of the pitfalls in the current understanding of both body image and also eating disorder treatment?
Right. So again, I'll come back to that stereotype. It is important. I harp on it because it's so important, and I just want to get the message out there. I think a lot of the severity of eating disorders could possibly be mitigated if people were able to identify it early on. Early on into their struggle, if someone was like, hey, I think that's actually an eating disorder, but because someone maybe identifies as Latinx or LGBTQ+, it's not seen that way. Only white, able-bodied cis women get eating disorders when they're in college, right? False. Studies right now are showing that the prevalence of Latinx's, the prevalence rate for eating disorders is the same as white women. So it's the same across the board. It's about 10% in every community. So I think that's important to know.
Yeah.
Which for a long time there was this idea that it wasn't, right? That like
Right.
culture, quotation marks, you can't see my quotation marks, the culture was a protective factor.
Right, yes. So I think it can be, in a sense, any type of community can be a protective factor. A sense of community is a huge protective factor. Connection. But as we know, with connection can be deep wounding. So families, doesn't matter what kind of family background, can be stressful. Studies have also shown, and I'll say that the research is very new, so I don't know much more about it than this fact that if we look across generations for immigrants coming in from Latin communities, from Latin countries, the second generation born in America, individuals are at the highest risk of actually having an eating disorder. Why is that? Kind of a blending of two different cultures, right? You come from a culture that food is seen as love, is seen as community, is seen as all of these wonderful things. Then you're thrown into another kind of culture where food is demonized in some ways. Good food, bad food, your worth is based on what you look like. But in one other kind of culture, it is kind of nice to have maybe more curves, but maybe not in this other culture. So it's kind of balancing this two different worlds that can be stressful.
And I guess, again, in thinking about, specifically what you specialize in, I wonder if you could talk more specifically for the queer community of additional stressors or additional issues in terms of what we're, quote unquote, supposed to look like or supposed to act like.
Absolutely. So, of course, the other thing about eating disorder treatment is it's super gendered, and not everyone ascribes to what is the traditional gender role. So I would say, there are tons of books out there like treat your eating disorder like it's a bad ex-boyfriend and just say goodbye. It's like, well, what if I don't want a boyfriend? Right. What if I don't like boys? Or what if I don't want any relationship?
Yeah.
So it can be super traditional, and it totally misses the mark and really helping people fully recover because it doesn't make it applicable to anyone. So I think that is a really not super helpful thing. Also in the trans community, I think one of the posts that you maybe what brought me here to this podcast is that in the trans community and non-binary community, it's 4.6 times more likely that someone who identifies as trans or gender nonconforming will develop an eating disorder. And that is an astonishing difference.
Yes.
But ask me how many treatment providers out there know how to work with the trans and gender nonconforming community.
How many?
3? Maybe 3. Yeah. Who are actual eating disorder specialists?
Yeah.
Probably 1 or 2. And
Yeah.
one of them is sitting right here talking to you.
Yes.
So I think that is a pitfall, is that there's just not enough training across the board on how to actually work with folks who experience this oppression, this marginalization, and who are just different than the norm, than tradition. And that is not helping people recover.
Yeah. I kind of want to follow that up and ask, so it sounds like you've been in different settings that are treating eating disorders, and you now have private practice, and you've been maybe working with other colleagues in the past as well. And so I'm wondering, what do these conversations look and sound like with those other colleagues? Are they happening? Do you hear some of that oppression replicated ever? And, because I think that's something we run into as students and as new social workers especially. What are the people around you saying? And how do you know when to interject your voice? And
Right.
how does that affect the way that you work as well?
Right. More and more, I think, as I am a clinician longer and I have my professional ego strength getting more and more solid, I feel more able to kind of call it out. So I do suggest that folks who have a little bit more experience get to use that privilege, right, of the privilege of having a little bit more seniority in the field, of saying, hey, actually, what I heard you say may not be up to date. And so inviting a conversation instead of like, hey, what you said actually was really stupid. Even though that's what I really want to say half the time.
Yeah.
Yes.
And in the treatment of eating disorders, it is actually ethical, best standard, almost required for professionals to collaborate because it is a multidisciplinary approach. I talk to dietitians all day long, doctors, psychiatrists, if I can reach them. I'll track them down somehow. And I talk to them all the time. So, and at this point, I really try to only work with the folks who I trust and who I know will take good care of my clients. I do not want anyone to be misgendered, which means it's a big deal. So I really have not had to experience much working with providers who don't quite get it. When I've done presentations, though, and talked about gender identity, sometimes people's heads explode. They're like, what? That's different than sexual orientation? Like, yeah, it's super different. Super different.
I can imagine, especially working with like the medical profession.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thankfully, the psychiatrists that I've referred to, they get it. They're awesome. And there's one medical doctor here, I'm going to say her name because she's amazing, Dr. Maria Monge. She works at Dell. So she primarily works with adolescents, but can also see adults for sure, and is amazing. She's awesome. She does work with eating disorders and also helping folks transition medically.
Oh,
Awesome.
Yeah.
wow.
She's great.
Yeah, shout her out.
Yes, I'm like, Dr. Monge, I love you.
Yeah.
I want a million more of her.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
do more than one. So in your ideal world, what would a more inclusive recovery space look like?
Better furniture. I mean, it really starts from something as what it might seem as small as a little flag on your website. Just the right words saying, I get it, and I get you. And if I'm trying to get you, if I don't belong to that community, I mean, I'm identify as queer, so I have a little bit of, different understanding of what it means to be queer, but you don't have to be a part of the community to work with somebody who might be LGBTQ+, Latinx, et cetera, et cetera. But just having the language out there that you are welcoming and inclusive of all is big. And it's actually surprising out there how many people aren't. It's really sad. But furniture is a big one. I know office space in Austin is hard to come by, but having furniture that is inclusive of all sizes, across that is body diverse. So no, I mean, couches or a love seat or something, maybe chairs that don't have arms, making your office accessible, ADA compliant. That is another thing I see often is a very like ableism focused environment. And in Austin, actually, a lot of offices are not accessible by an elevator.
Right. Lots of stairs. Yeah,
Lots of stairs.
Too.
Yeah.
Somebody who has a hard time with stairs.
Yeah. And it really sucks. And I mean, there's not much we can do to control that. We all can't have offices on the first floor or have office buildings with elevators, but something to consider, or at least having a plan. Like, I'm thankful I have an office with an elevator, but if I didn't, I would make sure I have an office space I could rent in, you know, if I have a client that needs to start using elevators, or have future clients that need elevators.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great point, too, because disability isn't necessarily something that everyone is born with or that is stable over time. And so if, you know, you have a client that you've worked with and you've established rapport and then all of a sudden their ability changes, I think that's also a really good point about accessibility, in that what does that do to their relationship if on top of everything else they're dealing with in changes in their life that they also can't access therapy in the same way?
Absolutely. Yeah. So just always thinking about that, I think shifts your whole practice and makes it more inclusive. Paperwork is also a big one. So making it, you know, right, what pronouns do you use, sex, being if you need to know their actual sex, which as a therapist we kind of don't really, but just gender, and not making it so binary. I just do fill in the blank, like gender, write in what it is, and that makes it more inclusive. Having forms that are also in Spanish or other languages, right? Making it super accessible. I work with kiddos who parents are Spanish speaking. The kid speaks English, but I want my well, first of all, they need to have consent. The parents need to consent, so I need to have forms that also make it easy for them to know what's happening.
Yeah.
In terms of treatment programs, that's a whole different podcast.
Is it? I mean, we can...
You want to do it? Let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Let's blast it out.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
I think all of it needs to be changed from hiring practices. That's the other thing. I think maybe my intention for the year is to somehow go out and recruit more and bring in folks who are Latinx, LGBTQ+, Black, all different marginalized communities.
All of them
together.
Just one person.
In one person, do it all now. But I think as a profession, it's very white. And so that is my intention, is to make it less white, less straight, less cis, all of the things.
I feel like that should be all of our intentions all the
Yes.
time in all the spaces.
I love that. It's a great intention.
That is the new resolution for
Cool.
2019. I never do resolutions, but
I don't either. But that can be
This
one.
is a good one. Less white.
hey, we're already doing that.
slogan for the podcast. Making things less white.
Things less white. I
Love it. Yes.
Yeah.
So from hiring practices all the way to treatment groups that they're offering. So, and not just that, but maybe training. A lot more diversity, inclusion, and equity training. I've worked at treatment centers. I know the diversity training that they have. It's not that great. This was, it's been a few years, but I don't know that much has changed in their, curriculum. But
Can you fill us in a little bit about what that looks like?
yeah, I think it's like, what is ethnicity? What is race? Like, okay. Not actually like, how do you be inclusive? How do you
Right.
check your own biases and your own racism? And how do you still do good clinical work? And how do you get supervision? And how do you get consultation about it?
Yeah.
That's what I think actual good diversity, inclusion, equity training is. Talking about oppression. Yeah.
For sure. Agreed.
Agreed.
It's time to refill our cups. Join us at the table for a nice chat and a cup of tea in a part of the episode we call the sobremesa. So Alejandra, I think in this sobremesa, we really want to think about how to end the season on a high note and a reflective tone, and also really wrapping together everything we've talked about in all of our different episodes. And today, especially because of the topic that Neathery has brought in, thinking through accessibility, both in social workspaces and more broadly. And I was really thinking about this idea because I was invited to be on a panel of social workers at St. Ed's to talk to bachelor's students about master's programs and licensure and all kinds of things. And the panelists and I really got onto the topic of accessibility in terms of what spaces we feel like we can take ownership of, and encouraging these students to understand the world that they're going into, but also not be afraid to make change in it.
Yeah, I think this is especially appropriate in this episode because it's all about taking up space, and so much of it is about our bodies and the way that they take up space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this applies to so many different identities, right? Like we talked about size in this episode, but we also have talked about race, and we've talked about language, and we can talk about gender, sexual orientation, and all of these different identities come with them ideas about what spaces they belong in or should be in or can be in. And we definitely, in this panel, we're talking about how schools of social work tend to be spaces that are predominantly white, but also that tend to be spaces that are not always open to people of all genders and are not always open to people of all abilities. And I know that's something you've specifically faced. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about your experiences with navigating that.
Yeah, sure. So I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease my first semester in my first year of grad school, and it's been a really, I guess I'm going to use the word interesting. It's been an interesting thing to observe as somebody who's becoming a social worker, because I've thought about disability before, and it's something that's been in my life through other family members, but I had never dealt with it. And all of a sudden, I'm considered a disabled person and having to navigate that for the first time, and having to be in a body that can't do the same things that it was able to do just a year or two prior. And it's been interesting because I think I had this idea that the School of Social Work, it would be a breeze because it's all social workers. And I've heard horror stories from people in other departments, and it's definitely better than other departments, but there's still been a lot of challenges. We're protected by the students, the
Services for Students with Disabilities?
Services for Students with Disabilities, and that comes with different accommodations. And even in the School of Social Work, I can't always use my accommodations because of the way that the class is designed.
Right.
Or, just especially in terms of time, probably one of the biggest issues for me in this program is the time it takes to get things done, is being able to show up all the time. Autoimmune disease is unpredictable, which makes my life unpredictable. And when I can't use those accommodations, I've taken hits to my grade. I've had to withdraw a couple of times, and that's just been the reality.
Yeah, I think you would, like you said, hope that a School of Social Work would maybe have a better understanding. But I think one thing that I know we've talked about with autoimmune and other disabilities that are maybe less visible is this idea of really helping people understand, and that ends up being the work you have to do, what differences you do have in energy or capacity or the unpredictability of it. And when people can't see it, it makes such a difference. My mom has an autoimmune disorder, and I know that it really hit her, this difference, when she ended up like dislocating her shoulder or something, and she was in a sling. And she said that in the time that she was in a sling, more people asked to like open doors or get cans off of shelves or all these different things than in all the time that she had struggled with like blurred vision or getting out of bed or migraines or whatever other things that she was dealing with. But when people can see it, it does sort of make a distinction. And that's not to say that the school is fully accessible for people with visible disabilities either, but just I think that adds sort of a layer.
Yeah, like this idea of like, you look healthy to me,
right?
Therefore you must be. I had a similar experience in London. I ended up needing a brace because of the amount of walking and going up and down the stairs a lot. And that brace like changed everything. Like all of a sudden people were like letting me sit down in the tube. And people in London are so, English people are so polite. And so I would just be like, I have a disability. Can I sit there? I know not everybody feels comfortable doing that, but at certain points I was like, I have to sit. But when I had the brace, that kind of did the talking for me. And so, there's definitely within the community a lot of discussion about what it means to have a visible disability and an invisible disability and sort of the pros and cons that come with both.
Sure. And I think, this idea that we've also talked about of how spaces are designed, but also how all of this is conceptualized for who belongs in what space. And so that this is always in relation to how we think about ability, which is a really limited conceptualization. And that if we expanded our idea of different abilities, then we wouldn't have to label people in that way either.
Yeah, it's limited and it's limiting, and not just to the person with the disability. I think for the larger population, there's a lot of insight and creativity that comes from folks with disability, and also just anybody who's been marginalized. I think anybody in a marginalized community, in order to survive, has to be more creative, and a lot just comes out of that experience. And so we're really doing a disservice to everyone when we don't open up those spaces. Something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and something I've heard other people talk about, is this idea that, and you were kind of touching on this idea that disability is not on the person, but rather the structure. We only call it a disability because other people aren't willing to shift their perspective about what it means to be productive, what it means to work. And I think what really it comes down to is what it means to be a person worthy of existing in this society. And that's really hurtful.
Absolutely. I think it always comes down to worth and who is worthy and who is unworthy. And a lot of the systems have been set up in really unsustainable ways that people are being expected to produce so much. And we can think about a lot of spaces, but I don't think schools of social work are an exception. People are constantly doing internships and field placements, and not only are they not getting paid to do them, they are paying to do them. And you're expected to do that on top of classes, and a lot of us work through that, and you just are putting a burden on people that they absolutely don't need to have, and that some people just don't have the capacity to do, because we all have different capacities. And so what that means is that people with more privilege are more likely to A, get to those spaces, B, feel that they actually have ownership over those spaces, and C, be successful in those spaces, which has a really big impact in the future. And I think we can think about all the spaces we've talked about in this season, organizing and thinking about mental health spaces, but also workspaces and the legal field. And all of them have this problem. And I think what that does for students is the idea of imposter syndrome that I think is getting more and more talked about, which I think also can feel very lonely of, do I really belong here? Do I actually deserve a place here? Do I really matter here?
Exactly, especially when you have to ask for accommodations.
Yes.
And you have to remind, and that's been the big thing for me, is constantly having to remind everyone, basically, that I have this disability and I have accommodations, and like they need to be respected. And even reminding them they aren't always respected or not possible, and I say that with quotation.
Well, and I feel like that idea is sort of like proving yourself happens even when your difference is visible. And like people of color, for example, in grad school, just this constant proving yourself of being intelligent enough or being capable enough or having the right experience that other people don't have to do. And we were even talking about, you know, who goes and asks for the scholarship or who feels comfortable enough to network, to find the resources. And we are innovative and creative, of course, to survive, but there is a certain ownership that comes with privilege of feeling that you can demand what you need.
Yeah.
And people who haven't been taught that, oftentimes I think that's part of the struggle too.
No, I totally agree.
And I think it comes down to really, I think today, us wanting to tell people who listen to this podcast if they've ever felt that they were not deserving, or if they've ever felt that they were sort of outsiders in their field or in their classes, that is an artificially created understanding of what that space should look like.
Yeah.
And you bring a unique and important perspective to whatever work you're going to do, and you matter and you deserve to be there. And so I just want us all to like own it.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And it's a constant reminder because it's so easy to forget, and it's the forgetting is reinforced.
Absolutely.
So it's always coming back to that I'm worth it, I belong here,
Yes.
I have a lot to offer.
Yes.
I'm actually a little bit curious about your experience.
Yeah.
Because I know you've done a lot of organizing around making our program much more language accessible.
Yeah, specifically accessible in terms of bilingual social work in
Yes.
Spanish and English, but I think that's important regardless of what that second or third language is that people speak. It's another way in which systematically over time it has been excluded, right? We can go back to thinking about times in Texas where you weren't allowed to speak Spanish in school. And there's people I've talked to who had that experience that are now bilingual social workers, actually.
Yeah.
And having to have their name changed to Mary from Maria.
Yeah.
And the feeling of that, right? And so when we have a legacy of oppression, and in this case around language, the systems are not set up to support the cultivating of practitioners that are going to be able to be fully bilingual and understand what that means, taking that idea of cultural competency or cultural humility to a whole other level. And so I think a lot of people see their program as a short amount of time. There's not enough space or capacity to make change. And I think that we really need to rethink that. We need to understand that we are change makers and we can be. And I have worked really hard with other students to advocate within the school to increase the resources for bilingual social workers and to increase the understanding of the importance for cultivating that particular skill. And that people come in already sometimes speaking Spanish, and then they're expected to just do social work in Spanish.
Yes.
And just because we came in and we spoke English didn't mean we were ready to do social work in English.
Yeah.
So we can't be expecting people without specific training in Spanish to understand all the vocabulary, to feel that they have all of the concepts under their fingertips, right?
Yeah, social work is a language.
It
too.
is a language,
Yeah.
and we have to learn it in whatever languages we're going to use it. And so I do think it's a social justice issue because we have clients that need us to be fully capable in other languages, and that needs to be part of our training. And so I think like the big takeaway for me is how that's applicable to any need, right?
Yeah.
Or to any identity, that change can start at the educational institutions. Not only can it, but it has to.
Yeah.
Because that's where we're producing the future social workers. And this is true for any field. That's where we're producing the people that are going to then go out into the world and make change. And if we're not teaching them from that moment, if we're not making change from that educational place, then we're not going to be able to expect our systems to change and our profession as a whole to change. And now back to the interview. I just want to make sure we've like really wrapped up the inclusive recovery space questions. So I want to make sure if there's anything else we want to...
I have a few more things to add on that real quick.
Please do.
Another thing is to add different groups that actually target what someone's lived experience is and not just make it so standardized across the board and really making it individualized. I think it's super easy to add identity groups, minority stress groups, social justice groups, particularly if it's residential or partial hospitalization program, which they're there at programming all the time. It's really easy to add a couple of groups. It's also really easy and super harmful when staff are not adequately trained. I've had an experience where a boss actually would misgender a teenage client of ours, did say it was a phase and that they didn't believe her. And I was like, I'm pretty sure it's not a phase. And unfortunately, in those spaces, when there is a power differential, it can be hard to speak up. And so I just did my best. It was not a boss I could confront in that way. So I just did my best to convey to the client and to the other providers of like, hey, this is what I know about working with folks who are trans, and this is what we have to do.
Well, yeah, and everybody should have the opportunity to figure out who they are.
Yeah.
Like that's what adolescence is. It's just
It's not adulthood too, right?
yeah,
right?
no, you're done. But like especially adolescence.
'Cause I'm still working on
right?
that.
Fully baked. Yeah, no.
Like how it's like
Yeah.
so great that, you know, I think when we were younger, it wasn't as open, right? Like
Yeah.
like you couldn't try on different identities, you couldn't like explore your own gender. Like gender is not this
Right.
like it's not male female. There's all sorts of ways to express it, and sexuality is something that's supposed to be pleasurable and enjoyable, and like it's this
Yes.
thing that's like so fraught.
To devalue someone's own experience or humanity because of how they're expressing themselves ever is just not okay.
Yeah.
Not okay. I love what you said earlier, I think, when we were mic testing or checking, 1 2 1 2 check check, is that we're, in some ways, the distress that we're experiencing is that we're trying to escape the unavoidable, which is our non-existence. And I think in a deeper sense, that's kind of what eating disorders is all about. In some ways, I've said this, and it's kind of said out there in the treatment world that the eating disorders are slow suicide.
Yeah.
And so making spaces that make space for everyone is a life or death matter, and it should not be something that is crossed off a budget line. Spend the money to train your staff, spend the money to actually cultivate your own awareness, go to trainings, just listen to people talk who are of marginalized communities, and just listen. Inviting yourself to go and to bring people to come. Educate the staff. That's another big one. So
Yeah. And then hire diverse staff.
Hire.
who
Yes.
can bring some of that knowledge in also, right?
Yeah.
Just by being themselves.
Yeah.
Like, look, it's okay.
Right.
I exist.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I have a job. Like,
I think, so obviously whoever's listening to this, if people are listening to this, I hope so.
People
Maybe.
are listening to this.
You can't see, maybe if you check out my website, but I have half of a shaved head. And the moment that I actually looked more queer, I think made it safer for so many of my clients to discuss with me some of their own sexual orientation, things that are going on. So I think having representation is extremely important. And so anyone who's listening, if you are part of any marginalized community and you want to work with eating disorders, please contact me. I'd love to collaborate with you and would love to provide training.
Yeah, and we'll definitely link to your website and Instagram and all the things
Yes.
with this podcast for sure. So as we're talking about the different diverse needs that many communities, and we can focus on Austin, have, I wonder what you see as needs that are currently not being met in the Latinx community. And you could speak more generally as a social worker, but
Sure.
also specific to eating disorders if you like. And if you've seen documentation status affect treatment.
Yes. I would say one of the biggest barriers, I think, is access to care. And when I say care, I don't just mean like a doctor. I mean an actual specialist. Insurance coverage for eating disorder treatment is just a nightmare. Most clinicians and dietitians are private pay, some with a sliding scale, but oftentimes even a sliding scale isn't accessible to all. So really the front line, maybe community centers, having a trained eating disorder clinician would be great. So again, access to care. Documentation status, when I've come across, is just another layer of stress. I've been able to work out a sliding scale with folks for them to come see me. And really, I think it does make it hard for people to come forward. In the Latinx community, the first kind of the most accepted understanding of an eating disorder is that it's a physical illness. And so families are willing to take loved ones to a doctor, but when it requires more treatment, that's kind of a longer discussion. Again, it requires funding somehow if you want to see a specialist. And I think it, for sure, right now, why come out of the shadows and make yourself known if you face the very real threat of being sent away?
So, additionally, in Austin in general, are there any other needs of the Latinx community that you see as not being met or that you'd like to see be met differently?
Honestly, I really just think not just representation, but presence. A lot of, I would say maybe the bigger organizations could do a really awesome job of maybe showcasing more Latinx specific topics, CEUs. There's, I think just a handful of therapists who I know out there who are presenting like CEUs on training other providers like how to work with the Latinx community, which is awesome. So I think perhaps more of that, and just having other folks listen is the most important thing, and how we all work together collaboratively to make sure the folks who are most marginalized get the actual access to care, competent care, and compassionate care that they deserve.
Yeah, rather than it being this like sort of separate thing or this, like when you talk about Latinos in the media, for example, which is something that we talk about, like as we're working on this podcast and getting more representation out. Like I think for a long time there was idea that like stuff like media for Latinos is just for Latinos, and like it's not, and like the same like treat like these presentations are just for Latinos when it's like no,
Right.
we're like, especially in border states where like 40 to 50% of the population like everybody's has to deal with us. So sit down and listen.
Yes, it is. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely not separate. We are much more stronger as a community together than separate. No walls, no borders, right? Yes. We're just all together here. And I think joint collaboration, right? Latinx therapists providing education, Latinx community members expressing what their story is, and everyone else just listening. It's really, just listen. Please just listen. And allow yourself to be humbled and be trained by others.
Yeah, and all the important intersections there too, right? Because there's certainly, an anti-queer bias within the Latinx community that we could absolutely spend a whole podcast talking about. And then there's certainly racism among the queer community. And there's certainly, we can look at all the different intersections of all of our lives and how all of the forms of oppression cause us to treat other people, right? And I think that the idea of coming together also and listening also being a way of connecting some of that gets disconnected, that a lot of the same forces of oppression are causing a lot of us to feel badly about ourselves or feel that anger that you talked about, and we're almost doing it in silos sometimes,
right?
And then getting turned against each other, which is definitely a tool of oppression, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Is turning people against each other,
right?
But what does it look like to really listen and bring people together and understand that everyone has an intersection of identities and biases and all of that? And I think that that's really hard work, but as social workers, I feel like that's kind of our calling, right?
It's kind of in our ethics.
Our DNA.
It is.
In our
social
rule
work
book.
DNA.
In theory, but I think, this conversation and others is pointing out ways in which it's not always happening.
Right. And to get those, I guess, right now, the folks who hold power to actually support it is maybe where social workers can intervene. And I think that can be done through legislative work, through just calling, through just, more grassroots style organization. And that's what we can do.
Definitely.
together, not against each other, right?
Yes, exactly.
There is enough human suffering to go around.
we don't need to add to it.
No, I mean, like, it's not a competition.
Right.
Like,
Right.
sometimes you, like, are in the social justice world and, like, people are, like, really protective. And I'm like, yo, there's, like, so much shit going on. Like,
Right.
I don't understand.
Like comparing shit is
or just
not productive.
like, at least in the communities I've been in, like, there's a lot of, like, people being really protective of their own work and, like, a lot
Yeah.
of protagonism.
Yeah.
And, like, oh, he's not doing it the right way. She's not doing it the right
Yes,
way.
that's definitely a thing.
Yeah. Can we just stop shaming each other? It is bold and courageous to speak up, and why not foster that with each other?
Absolutely. And like you were saying earlier, figure out ways then to do that up the ladder.
Right.
If there are people in power, even let's say in an organization, within an organization itself, what are the ways that you can advocate? And oftentimes that does require maybe being more subtle or being gentler or, but that can still have anger behind it. And that can absolutely still be, I think, leaning in the direction of radical change, because oftentimes there's just not a voice in the room to speak up. And I think oftentimes people who hold marginalized identities are the ones who feel like they always have to be the ones to
Right.
speak up. And that's another thing that, is important for us to do, but also figure out how allyship can work even across different marginalized identities to make sure that you have support in the room if you are going to say something.
And always, always, always use your privilege when you have it. So I'm mixed. I'm Hispanic. My mom's Mexican. I'm third generation born. But I'm white on the outside, brown on the inside. So I use my white skin to be able to go and just talk. And I have that safety because I am white. And people perceive that differently, unfortunately.
Definitely. I think I can relate to that.
Yeah, I think we all can. We've definitely had this conversation many times
Yes.
about just passing.
Yeah.
Its own topic.
Yeah, we could definitely do a whole podcast on passing. But there is a certain privilege in that can be used and definitely can be a useful tool in advocating, because I think that being listened to, being heard, but also being able to, maybe in a different way than someone who has no family from other countries or other cultures or other experiences, able to carry some of those voices forward.
Right. I think we're here, at least starting this year, 2019, our House of Representatives being the most diverse, the most with female identified folks. I think we're ready for change to come. I'm so excited to see.
We've touched on this a little bit, but I would like you to expound. What advice would you have for new or long-term therapists in the community who are interested in working with eating disorders in marginalized communities?
Training and training and training. So eating disorders are the most fatal mental illness. I don't like saying that word, mental health struggle out there. Textbooks say illness, but whatever.
Textbooks also can use oppressive language.
Yes, there you go. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, like, look at the textbooks that are just like, and it was a volunteer work program when they're talking about slavery.
Right. Volunteer work program.
Well, even
Let's
social work
laugh.
textbooks from not that long ago that still have D on transgender and
Right.
it says transgendered.
Right.
And they're not from that long ago. So I think, it's fair to question.
It is, right? So eating disorders, though, have the highest mortality rate. And to not be trained adequately and say you work with eating disorders is a huge ethical issue. There's tons of training out there. If anyone's interested, I can help either train you or point you in the right direction. But training. And we can always use more specialists in the field who know how to work with marginalized communities, who are inclusive, who are extremely anti-oppression and have a social justice lens, because eating disorders are a social justice issue, hands down across the board.
So in thinking about your work and all of the different topics we've covered today, is there anything that we didn't ask you about that you think we should have or that you'd like to talk about?
I could really talk for hours about all of this. I'm like, oh, I forgot about that. Oh, I need to say that. But I think listeners would be here for maybe 7-8 hours.
Let's do it.
You ready?
Yeah.
7-8 hours. Let's
7 to 8
go.
hours on the topic. I have somewhat mixed feelings about the name of it, but I love health at every size. Have you all heard of it before? Okay.
Yes.
I mean, if you follow me, hopefully.
Yeah,
you've
yeah, yeah.
Seen a thing or two.
And I also have some mixed feelings
Yeah.
about the name. But
the name
peop-
health, right? It's
yeah.
super ableist. And my most favorite actual term for this movement is actually fat liberation. The word body positivity nowadays is so watered down that it's only like body positive if you still look a certain way. But fat liberation is really talking about complete actual anti-oppression liberation for bodies across the weight spectrum. Why it's important is because there is so much bias out there, weight stigma, especially in the medical community. There is a word out there. It starts with an O. I will not say it because it is a very derogatory word, but it's an O epidemic. I'm sure you could fill in the blank.
Yeah. Got
And
it.
you got it? Okay. I will not say it. And it is so fat shaming. And that is, I mean, diet culture itself is fat shaming. So we cannot control our weight. Spoiler alert. That is just how our bodies are. Much like we really can't control our height or the color of our eyes. So just know that that's, one thing I'd really like people to know is that you can't just say, oh, just, do this and this with your food and you'll be fine. Our bodies are what they're going to do what bodies do. And that doesn't make someone a lesser than person.
Yeah, and I can already hear some brains exploding like, listening to this.
Right. What? I don't have to diet?
Yeah. But and I guess I just want to add to that there's a lot of research supporting this, and that a lot of the things that the health outcomes that we see of the supposed O epidemic are actually based on weight stigma. It's the stigma and the stress of being labeled a certain way and treated a certain way that are causing these health outcomes, and not your weight in and of itself.
And it's not even, it is for sure weight stigma, but it's also weight cycling that cause the elevated heart risk, heart health issues, insulin, all of those things that they credit to being in a larger body are predominantly due to, well, one, genetics, for sure. You can't change genetics. And two, weight cycling, which means the yo-yoing. So what most people out there are doing, starting diets, stopping diets, losing weight, gaining weight, losing weight, gaining weight, when really all your body needs is to just be. And that is the best predictor of a health outcome, is just consistency and stability in your body. And there's tons of research out there. I'm happy to, send them to you for the show notes or whatever.
Yeah.
But that is, I mean, my favorite topic right now is fat liberation. And I would say how it intersects with the Latinx community. I mean, I think just across all communities, it kind of blows people's minds of like, what? What? So I think...
Well, what, or also like, no.
No. Just no. Like, you're wrong.
You're wrong.
Yes.
Yeah.
What and no, you're wrong. And then I'm like, here's the research. Like, that's wrong.
Yeah.
What about all of these programs? Well, if dieting worked, you wouldn't have to diet ever again.
Right.
Again, it intersects across all cultures, but for Latinx community, I think there is, I know when I was growing up, I was called gordita a little bit when I was just a normal prepubescent child.
Right.
That's what girls do, is they normally gain weight, then get tall. Boys usually get tall, then gain weight.
Some of us just don't ever get tall.
And that's just how you're meant to
And
be.
and that's amazing.
Yeah.
I think another thing I want listeners to know is that why this fat liberation movement is so huge,
Pun
pun intended,
Yeah.
is so important, is that, so there's her name's Jess Baker, and she's a wonderful author, advocate out there, and she's described how she's gone to the doctor for strep throat. And usually you go to the doctor, kind of just want an antibiotic, and you're on your way. Well, she goes, and the doctor says, have you tried losing weight?
For strep throat.
Right? And so that is the life of someone in a larger body in this culture right now. You go in for knee pain, have you lost weight? You go in for maybe some lab work is wonky. You should lose weight, and here's all these horrible ways that will not work. and actually damage you that you should try. The biggest precursor out there for an eating disorder is dieting. And so I'm very, very, very loud and proud about being anti-diet. And that's another piece to the work that I have with my clients is being anti-diet.
Yeah. I guess I wonder, we've talked about oppression as something that can definitely be a factor in an eating disorder, and now diet can be a precursor. I'm just curious if there's anything else you'd want to add about, what can cause this, because I think, as you were saying at the beginning, we don't want to ask necessarily what the problem is. The problem is not the problem. The problem is what's behind it, right?
Right.
And so when you're saying that earlier, I'm wondering what other things you see that are kind of behind the problem.
The biggest precursor, as I said, was dieting and genetics, right? Genetics we're seeing are about 80%. There's a higher risk if you have a family member who's had an eating disorder before. So mix that with our culture that we live in, maybe throw in some traumatic experiences, and it's a perfect recipe for someone with an eating disorder. So again, I think that's the biggest thing, is that there's a genetic predisposition and then something within the environment. Could be dieting, could be bullying at school, could be parents' divorce, could be family of origin stressors, could be so many other things, medical trauma, just anything else to add, the added stress for folks to try to cope with.
My supervisor at the Y, Eva Escobedo, who we had on before, does trauma treatment, and so does Maya at the Y, but they both do it with somatic experiencing. So I'm curious to know, as someone who works with eating disorders, if you have ever worked with another professional working through somatic experiencing, especially because eating disorders, I feel like, there's like this connection or disconnection with the body specifically, right?
Right. And a large percentage of folks who have an eating disorder also have a trauma history. So I am EMDR trained, and I do use that in my practice. So addressing the body and making recovery all about reconnecting with who you are in body, mind, spirit is the work. A long road, but it's possible.
Awesome.
All right, I think we're at our last
We
question.
are, which is yours.
And it's my favorite question.
And it's your favorite question.
So, what is your favorite herb or tea?
I love mint tea. It's my favorite. It is equally calming and refreshing and rejuvenating. So it really does whatever I need it to do in the moment. It can either be calming when I sip it before yoga, or I need to get to work and be alert.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's awesome to be here.
Thank you for listening to our last episode of Season 1 of the Latinx Mental Health Podcast.
We made it!
As part of our conclusion to the season, we continued our conversation about ability and access in a brief segment.
Before we play that for you, we want to take a moment to thank some important people who have made this podcast possible.
First, thank you so much to Leo Schuster, who is one of our producers and our audio engineer who sat through recording and editing sessions and has made us sound great.
We also want to give a big thanks to our communications coordinator, Alicia Hernandez, who, as our resident young person, has helped us understand the social medias, taken great photos, and taught us the term spilling the tea.
We want to thank every one of our guests for taking the time to share their stories and expertise with us.
And last but certainly not least, Alejandra's dog Paloma and Kat Nelson for making us feel at home in our podcast headquarters.
We appreciate everyone who has listened to this season, donated to help support our work, and given us feedback. We couldn't do this work without you.
And big shout out to our therapists for keeping us sane and grounded to do the work we are passionate about. And now, please enjoy the last segment of Season 1 of the Latinx Mental Health Podcast.
Yeah, so that even applies to the making of this podcast. And, we're just wrapping up our first season, and there have been so many lessons. So many things that we couldn't have anticipated. It's been a really, joyous experience, and it's been a headache at times. And I think, for the sake of transparency, maybe we should talk about that a little bit. Because really, podcasting is this wonderful tool that creates a platform for people who otherwise would not have a platform. And I think a lot of people could maybe benefit from our transparency, and if this is something that they want to pursue.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's talk about our process as we wrap up our season.
Processing our process.
Processing our process. We are social workers.
Yep.
Yeah, I think, even with the idea of ability and productivity and everything around that, like getting to know each other's capacities and styles and perspectives, and doing this while finishing school, starting work, doing field placements. This has been an interesting time of transition for us both, I think. And it's a really unique opportunity to like capture that as we were podcasting. We couldn't have predicted how that would kind of go together.
Yeah, because when we started, you had 3 jobs.
I did. And yeah, I think we've learned a lot from this process, but really I think this idea of, and we've talked about this, if we think back to this concept of ability, and making spaces more accepting, what does working together look like, right? And I think I've learned a lot from you about how to conceptualize that differently. And as I think about spaces I want to be in the future, I know we've talked about like, let's make sure the office has a couch.
Yeah.
And like people can work on the couch. And let's make sure that like work load and time and caseloads are flexible. And with the podcast, it's like, yeah, maybe we're not recording today because of whatever thing is happening in either of our lives, and having that flexibility and understanding and how that can translate into other workplaces.
Yeah, and I really appreciated this process and working with you, because I think I've had a lot of experiences in the workplace where I've felt like I've had to really push myself past my capabilities, or where I've had to feel apologetic, and I think I have felt apologetic, but it's more...
you have apologized, and I have not let you.
Exactly. Like, it's more on me, and to just have, your sort of reminders has been really helpful, and has shown me that there are different ways to work, because this is, it's not a perfect process. This podcast isn't perfect. We're still learning a lot, but we've done it.
Yeah.
In spite of everything, maybe because of everything.
Yes.
And yeah, I feel much more hopeful about my work life in the future. And that's sort of one of the tools of technology.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. The fact that we can, sit in your beautiful, what are we calling this? Room.
The podcast room.
The podcast room. The fact that, we can sit in this beautiful salmon-colored podcast room, and, that we can come to each other's apartments when that makes sense for each of our schedules and each of our days and our times and our energies. And, that we also are interviewing people who are able to have that same understanding if we need to reschedule or whatever piece of that oftentimes doesn't exist in other spaces.
Yeah.
And I think that's something for me, I may not have as many limitations in terms of energy, but I certainly can use a lot of reminders about what my capacity should be and actually is, and how much rest I should have, and how much time I should take for myself and outside of work and with the people that I love and care about. And I think being able to make sure that that's all balanced is a constant struggle for me, and it's something I've always worked on. And so doing something like this where there's a lot of honesty and transparency in the way that we talk about how to schedule things is really helpful.
Yeah.
And I think we'll get more and more efficient in our process as we have our takeaways from doing a season together.
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways, and something I think to consider when in or starting any working relationship, is that communication. Because this podcast for us is very personal.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is like we go into each other's homes.
Yes.
We record in my home. I think it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by it, and also like protective. And I think we agree on a lot, but we don't agree on anything. On everything.
There's something you haven't been telling me.
Yeah, I think we should maybe reconsider everything. No, we don't agree with it on everything. And learning how to be very open and honest before resentment hits.
Yes.
Because I think that's a really big risk when you're
Absolutely.
working so closely with somebody.
You're creating, and creativity, I think, comes with a certain amount of openness and sharing, and it is
vulnerability.
very personal and is very vulnerable. And so I think, like, yeah, there has to be an amount of trust there, but there also has to be an openness so that you're able to, like, just honestly put everything out on the table and then make decisions that work for everyone, which is sometimes a compromise and sometimes a, no, actually, that's a better idea. Like, let's do that, you know? But I think that because it's personal, that also makes it better. Like, that also makes it more engaging, and that also makes us care so much about doing this work. And I love that we get to bring people on that feel the same way and interview them and get their voices out there. And I'm excited to continue doing that.
Yeah, me too. And relationships are about work and are not free of conflict.
Yes.
And I think we have this idea as a society that they should be easy all the time. I mean, I don't think they should be difficult.
Or if they're hard, that, like, they're not worth having.
Yeah.
Or,
Like, if there's any sort of disagreement. And the truth is that that's not the case. That a relationship grows deeper with those conflicts.
absolutely.
When they can be resolved in an open and honest manner. And so I think we have a beautiful future together.
Y'all.
Going
You're so
forward.
hopeful today. I love
I
it.
know.
And, you know, I think we definitely want to take a minute to thank everyone who's been listening to the podcast this season and who's been so supportive and given us feedback and donated and done a lot of different things that has really helped us in this process to know that, you know, there are people that care about the work that we're doing, because obviously we care about it, but it is lovely to hear from people that they appreciate it. And you know, I'm really excited to see where it goes from here in season 2 and to create more content and
more connection with the audience.
And more connection, because it is about those relationships.
Yeah. I'm excited for people to maybe start writing reviews on our on our
Write
iTunes,
some reviews,
or to send us emails or
yes,
social media messages, and to really start engaging, because that's part of why we started this.
Yeah, we want to hear from you. So look out this summer as we are in our recording phase for some posts from us and ways that you can engage with us as we start to prepare season 2 and also hope to build out our community, our Latinx mental health podcast community. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Latinx Mental Health Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at LatinxMHPod, find us on Facebook and YouTube, and subscribe everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Hasta la próxima!